to the metal church. Bloody Roots. Reverend Ian Christie is about to begin. Bloody Roots. Please turn to page 666.
From the pages of Sound of the Beast, your weekly heavy metal history lesson with Ian Christie.
Yeah, greetings. This is Ian Christie on Bloody Roots, and today a playlist I can barely believe my eyes looking at this. Bloody Roots of grunge and metal, with tracks by Mudhoney, Green River, Earth, Soundgarden, Fecal Matter, of course the Melvins, plus covers by Machine Head, Grave, Impaled, SOD, and more. Launching the proceedings here in full witch-burning mode, it's Seattle sludge rock legends Tad with Salem, and you are listening to Bloody Roots. Yeah, that's Tad, Seattle grunge legends, fronted by the gargantuan behemoth man, Tad Doyle, who has recently surfaced in a metal project, ultra doom band called Lumbar, along with a member of Yob and a longtime employee of Southern Lord Records. Tad, definitely one of the most metallic bands to come out of the Seattle grunge explosion, but we are going to explore bloody roots of grunge and metal today. This is your weekly heavy metal history lesson. Every week we look at a different genre, a different stylistic variance, a different country, a different group of personalities, or a different landmark release or event or person in metal. But this week it's definitely veering off into the left-hand path, a tangent, looking at a part of the country that had its own isolated music scene in the early 1980s. There were very strong, substantial metal bands coming out of Seattle, namely Metal Church and Queensryche, both of whom came to international attention after self-releasing their debut albums. Kind of interesting, right? This was a place where the weather was kind of muggy a lot of the time. There was like a redneck lumberjack culture still dominating. There was, this is before the technology sector took over Seattle and turned it into a futuristic wonderland. This is back in the days of flannel, axes, lumberjack competitions, taxidermy, and Sub Pop Records, an independent label that specialized in Seattle era rock, got off the ground in the mid 1980s with very heavy metal influenced bands like Green River, Tad, who you just heard, the very Sabbathy Soundgarden, and a whole host of other bands, including, of course, the ultimate success story, Nirvana. We're going to be hearing tracks by other sub-pop bands, including Earth, really one of the heaviest bands ever known to grace this planet. And in fact, some would say Earth has changed the gravitational pull and force of this planet. Of course, there'll be some Mudhoney, Alice in Chains, and later on in the hour, covers of classic Seattle grunge tracks by pure metal bands, including Machine Head, Grave, Impaled, and Opeth. I'm Ian Christie, author of the book Sound of the Beast, the complete headbanging history of heavy metal, and I've just produced a book along with one of the founders of Sub Pop Records, Bruce Pavitt, called Experiencing Nirvana, Grunge in Europe 1989, which contains photos of Mudhoney, Tad, and Nirvana when they really were regional metallic bands from the Seattle area that ventured out to Europe for the first time and tried to make the cause for some American guitar rock back in the 80s, in the era of synth pop and overall wimpishness. Today's playlist is online at blog.bazillionpoints.com, and let's get down to it. This next band is seriously influential on the entire grunge phenomenon. It's the almighty Melvins. These days, metal legends in their own right, but back in the beginning, it was unthinkable that anyone would play such slow, gluey music. This track's called Heaviness of the Load, going back to the very, very beginning of Melvins' history, followed up by a band called Fecal Matter out of Aberdeen, Washington, which is Dale Crover of the Melvins and Kurt Cobain of Nirvana. Soundgarden, Earth, Green River, still to come. This is Bloody Roots of Grunge and Metal.
pages of Sound of the Beast. Your weekly heavy metal history lesson with Ian Christie. Liquid Metal!
Act out of loyalty, defend your free country, wish away pain. How now what bodies to save little families, surrealistic fantasy, land boring flame. Sickening pessimist, hypocrite master, conservative communist, apocalyptic bastard. Thank you, dear God, for putting me on this earth. Feel very privileged, death for my thirst. All the time, this master use and living out your data fusion in the your master, don't reveal the masquerading. Somebody said that they're not looks like I am. I know I can. Making enough good words as you go along. I said I saw. No reason to deny you is not treason for your fire. The vendor of the future, you obviously know the outcome of life.
Take it, baby, take it, baby, take it all. Take it, life is for me. Sure to impale my head on my head. Your words are like arrows, my head on my head. My mind's growing narrow. You got this for me, it hits me hard. You got this for me, you love me so. My head on my head. Your words are like arrows, my head on my head. My mind's growing narrow.
I
Hey, this is Ian Christie. You're listening to Bloody Roots of Grunge and Metal. Definitely, I'm not gonna lie. I definitely feel a little funny playing some of these tracks here on SiriusXM Liquid Metal. But on the other hand, it's right. It is. There's no other place for it, really. I mean, this band, Mudhoney, I saw them in 1988 on the tour for that single, and as a young, impressionable whippersnapper, thought, I don't really understand what this is, being like a dyed-in-the-wool, drilled-in-the-head metalhead, but I can understand how this is like an American version of Celtic Frost or something. And now, many light years later, after being exposed to a great big wide world of heavy influences, to me, Mudhoney kind of seems like the band if, in fact, Blue Cheer had been the first heavy metal band, which I don't believe they were. I think that's pretty clearly Black Sabbath. But if you want to be argumentative and say Blue Cheer did it, then Mudhoney is the modern heir apparent to Blue Cheer, no doubt, hands down. And I guess you would really, have to consider them qualified as metal in some way. But definitely heavy, featuring former Melvins bassist Matt Lukin on those early recordings. Before that, you heard the band Green River, which was the pre-Mudhoney band that was a little wilder and more punky and basically split up and became Pearl Jam on the one hand and Mudhoney on the other. Before that, Earth, Dylan Carlson's extremely out there, purely heavy band that at different times featured people like Kurt Cobain passing through the ranks, Joe Preston from Thrones and Melvins, and in recent years has just been hugely influential. Most obviously on the band Sun, who basically started life as an Earth cover band, but, also on every band that lets big, expansive waves of distortion and slow, grinding heaviness just crush all the landscape. Although Seattle had its own metal scene back at the time with bands like The Accused, Metal Church, even Queensryche, definitely there was a real heaviness to these early sub-pop bands that came, I guess, from 70s heavy rock and then distortion and then the later days of punk and hardcore when hardcore started to grow long hair and get more interested in not really metal stuff, but get into heaviness when De Kreutzen and Laughing Hyenas and Killdozer emerged out of the punk scenes across the Midwest and in other flannel flying places. I'm Ian Christie, author of the book Sound of the Beast, the complete headbanging history of heavy metal. And in fact, I talk about grunge in Sound of the Beast, saying to me, bands like Soundgarden, Alice in Chains, and Nirvana were heavier than the pop metal bands that they replaced. In the 1990s, you can't say Metallica and Megadeth went out of business. They had their biggest successes ever. Slayer didn't have gold records until the 1990s. And it was the bands like Poison, Motley Crue, and, Warrant that were hurting. That's who was replaced by something, to me, realer, more down to earth and more heavy. And in a nutshell, you could say that's the Seattle area grunge bands. And the influence of these bands is definitely still heard today in anything remotely stoner rock oriented. Like all these bands coming out of the West Coast that are down-tuned and playing kind of ultra bluesy doom rock, they owe a big, big debt to these bands that down-tuned and played bluesy grunge 20 years ago, I guess. Let's keep this avalanche of sludge rolling. We're going to get into some covers by pure metal bands, Machine Head, Grave, Impaled, and Opeth in just a few minutes. Wanted to just widen the circle a little bit, play some Coffin Break, Alice in Chains, a band that definitely earned their stripes in the metal world by touring with Megadeth, Slayer, and Anthrax in 1991. Grunt Truck, a band will be playing in like 5 minutes. We're on Roadrunner Records in the early 1990s and featured Tommy Niemeyer from The Accused, one of the most influential and extreme Seattle metal crossover bands of the 1980s. And just to show that Nirvana was a band that was raised partially on metal, like all these grunge bands, wanted to play this pretty blistering lo-fi live track recorded at Rhino Records in 1989 as a 4-piece, just after the release of their album Bleach and prior to the period, a few weeks before the period captured in the new book, Experiencing Nirvana, Grunge in Europe, 1989 by Bruce Pavitt. Definitely some major bashing going on here. Check out pardon the sound quality, but check out these Marshalls. The second guitarist, Jason Everman, has been fighting in Afghanistan with the Special Forces for about a decade now. Quite a change of scenery. I'm Ian Christie. This is Bloody Roots, your weekly heavy metal history lesson.
the pages of your heavy metal history lesson. Bloody Roots. Liquid metal!
Scaries on the wall. Scaries on his way. Watch where you spit. And if there's no wait until it's over, then you got hit. And you should have known better. And we died young. Faster we run. Down, down, down you're rolling. Watch the blood flow in the muddy sewer. Take another hit and bury your brother. And we died young. Faster we Scaries on the wall. Scaries on his way. Another LA trip. Full of secret place to bend you over. Then you got hit. And you should have known better. Faster we run. And we die young. New car, white walls, posh house. With the yard, got 2 kids. One in the shell, got a color TV, got a stereo. Got a wife, lives in the kitchen. Gonna be no Tuesday movies on Saturday. Go to mom's Sunday dinner. Harry next up in a wide picket fence. He went from the city. Someday soon they're building a pool. Then we'll have a barbecue, yeah. Tony's motor college when it's old enough. Then we'll have a party. 2 dogs and a chat. We even got a girlfriend. Six. Oh, you want all your session. Tomorrow, coffee drinking and empty. Homes empty dreams. Nightmares, nightmares. We're here, we never dream. Blaze, you go, never hate.
From the pages of Sound of the Beast, your weekly heavy metal history lesson with Ian Christie. Liquid metal!
When I was an idiot, culture were opinion. Got run away, ran away, ran away. Got run away, ran away, ran away. Yeah, but
right, there's Billy Milano taking on Kurt Cobain from Live at Budokan by the Stormtroopers of Death. As we look at grunge and metal today on Bloody Roots, your weekly heavy metal history lesson. I'm Ian Christie, author of the book Sound of the Beast, the complete headbanging history of heavy metal, and I guess inspired to do this by working on the new book, Experiencing Nirvana, Grunge in Europe, 1989, by Bruce Pavitt. Info on that at bazillionpoints.com/Nirvana. It is basically a collection of photos and diary entries covering a bunch of flannel-clad DIY distortion-heavy stage diving bands from Washington State that went over to Rome, Switzerland, Belgium, England, France, and basically turned the alternative rock world on its head by being super energetic and noisy and loud and aggressive and, you know, basically paving the way for the grunge invasion of the 1990s. I think if you were clued into the grunge happenings in the 80s, you tend to have a better outlook on the whole thing. There is definitely a feeling among metalheads that grunge took something away. And I kind of have noticed there's like a generational chunk. If you're over right now, like the age of, if you're like in your young 40s and higher, probably can connect the grunge bands to the 70s rock, that influenced that. Stuff like everything from Grand Funk Railroad to the Stooges and Blue Cheer. And then there's a whole young breed of younger metalheads that weren't around to witness the politics of the 90s and just think that they're good records. And then there's like a chunk of people kind of all in their 30s right now who were young when the grunge thing was happening and were frustrated that you were seeing like Soundgarden and Nirvana on the cover of Rolling Stone, while bands like, great bands like Death and Morbid Angel and Carcass were kind of like, pushed to the side, pushed to the perimeter. In the end, though, loud, aggressive guitar music finds loud, aggressive guitar music. You just heard SOD with Charlie Benante on guitars and Scott Ian switching over to play drums, covering Nirvana. And now we're going to get into a bunch of different approaches to covering grunge by death metal bands, some sickening gore grind, some very spacey, doomy music by Thou, and something just kind of like finger-pickingly mellow by Opeth. We've got Grave covering Alice in Chains in a sec, Impaled versus Nirvana, and this is Oakland's Machine Head tackling a Nirvana track called Negative Creep. I'm Ian Christie. This is Bloody Roots of Grunge and Metal on SiriusXM.
history lesson with Ian Christie. Bloody Roots. Liquid metal!
don't have any feeling.
The Melvins covering Mudhoney and Sweet Young Thing Ain't Sweet No More. With the track we heard that earlier this hour in its original, more blue cheer version by Mudhoney. And then there's Melvins just, opening up the tubs of fat, viscous heaviness and making it a full-fledged metal anthem, making it even more Celtic Frost than the original. I'm Ian Christie. Thank you for joining me today for Bloody Roots of Grunge and Metal. I hope this didn't test if you are biased against grunge and find it to be an affront to your metalosity. I hope that you found moments today to appreciate and ponder maybe the universal nature of the appeal of wild, energetic stage shows, howling acidic vocals, and distorted, down-tuned, sickening guitar riffs played on real, live, actual amplified electric guitars. I'm Ian Christie. Visit me online at bazillionpoints.com. Check out my book, Sound of the Beast, The Complete Headbanging History of Heavy Metal, and also the new book, Experiencing Nirvana, Grunge in Europe 1989 by Sub Pop Records co-founder Bruce Pavitt. Info on that at bazillionpoints.com/Nirvana, along with many other books, including Swedish Death Metal, Metallion, The Slayer Mag Diaries, Murder in the Front Row, Shots from the Bay Area, Thrash Metal Epicenter, and Hellbent for Cooking, The Heavy Metal Cookbook, and many, many others. Sign up to be notified about info on the upcoming Heavy Metal Movies book. I'll leave you here on the most mellow track of this hour. This is a transoceanic gesture of tribute by Sweden's Opeth, taking aim at Washington State's Alice in Chains. Thanks very much for joining me. The playlist is at blog.bazillionpoints.com. Know your roots. Check it out.
just heard Ian Christie's Bloody Roots. Liquid